Listen to your radio. Stay where you are and keep listening to your radio.
The control voice of a public information film, for generations unleashing words of cautionary wisdom about how we can prevent a multitude of horrors.
Drive carefully, darling.
Being killed on the road, burnt to death, abducted by strangers, drowned at sea, or crushed by tractors. But much more than that too. The public information film became your trusty companion through the complexities of growing up in a changing world, finding work, navigating government policy, and all complete with catchphrases etched into our memories and imagery and sounds scorched into our dreams and our nightmares.
Brain toward units, stand by for takeoff. Brain to left foot, clutch to floor.
See how quickly things can happen. Clunk, click.
Watch out!
Keep away from people you don't know, from strangers.
Army soldier, be the best.
They're a thought for the old. All their lives they've been used to pounds, shillings and pence. It'll be difficult for many of them to make the change. Help them.
Yes, the telephone can cause frustration and misunderstanding. But used properly, it is the quickest form of communication.
Come and look at my puppies. You'll love them.
Emergency! Calling Green Cross Man!
And to meet the challenge, British science and technology turn to the fundamental power of the universe itself, atomic energy.
I can't hear a word he's saying, you know. Hello. Dial 999 and ask for the Coast Guard.
When friends told Kate smoking heroin would make her feel good, they forgot to tell her something else. How bad it would also make her feel.
So don't be rude on the road.
And who can forget Charley, keeping us out of harm's way in the 1970s, later becoming a symbol of childhood nostalgia.
7, 8. Charlie says that if ever you see a box of matches lying around, tell Mummy because they can hurt you.
And revived today, along with a new voiceover by David Walliams.
I was being nice to Mummy, so I decided to make her breakfast. I looked around to see where we could plug in the toaster. I said we could plug it in here, but Charlie stopped me and said it could be dangerous. Charlie burned his paw when he stopped me from touching the socket. Charlie says never put too many powerful appliances in one socket as they can heat up and catch fire.
Our journey begins with the winding up of the Ministry of Information, which produced an abundance of propaganda films throughout the Second World War, to be succeeded by the Central Office of Information, the COI, its peacetime equivalent in April 1946.
Hello, Freddie. Yes, you may take off. Off you go.
Patrick Russell, Senior Curator at the British Film Institute.
The messages during World War II range from quite, if you like, generalised propaganda, the sort of thing you see in for example, Humphrey Jennings's great documentary films.
Okay, chaps, here we go.
Which are projecting an image of Britain both to itself and to the world at large, and particularly towards the American population, with a view to engaging Americans with the Allied war effort. But it's also dealing with much more practical matters of food economy, matters of rationing.
We're interrupting the program to give you a fuel flash. When you're making up the fire, be sparing with the coal.
Matters of taking care of your clothes, make do and mend. And what you see during this period is a real expansion of form. One of the things that's really fascinating about public information film is that it has as much variety as film itself has. A public information film can be anything that a film can be. It can be a documentary, it can be an announcement, it can be a news report, it can be an animation, it can be a drama, it can be a comedy, it could even, and this developed in the post-war period, it could even be a horror film. Public information film can be all of those things. What moving image is brilliant for is what we might call the light bulb moment. Switching the light bulb on above the viewer's head, making the viewer receptive to a message that they might not be receptive before. And as you trace the history forward from World War II into the post-war period and the work of the Central Office of Information, you really see those disciplines develop to their greatest height and depth.
Now, the main task was to promote the social agenda of Clement Attlee's newly elected Labour government. The BFI's Sue Woods.
A lot of the films were about regeneration, rebuilding the nation after the war, about industry, trying to get people back into employment. Servicemen, that was a big issue, men coming back after the war who were unemployed.
And in my opinion, women can do it. Women have shown what they could do in war, and now that the fighting is over, women intend to show the world what they can do in peace.
Trying to get women to go back almost to be housewives, but at the same time they needed the women to carry on doing things like teaching. There were a lot of social reforms that came about after the war.
July the 5th this year sees the fulfilment of centuries of social legislation, when the new National Insurance Acts come into operation. For the first time, everyone, or almost everyone, in the United Kingdom can insure against want.
Determined to build a new post-war nation, all the government departments had access to the COI and its team of highly skilled filmmakers to get their message across. Even Stafford Cripps, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, commissioned a set of films to explain the new fiscal policies in an entertaining and light-hearted way.
There was a company called Harrison Batchelor, who were an animation company who were making things in the war, but they made a series of films about the NHS, the introduction of the NHS, the Education Act.
There will be sickness and unemployment benefits, retirement pensions, maternity grants, death grants, widows' benefits. Under the new acts, everyone will be required by law to make a weekly contribution to the scheme.
And it's interesting, you mentioned that sort of period of the welfare state, Harrison Batchelor animation. Of course, it was also, in a way, the early days of characters being introduced.
I'm just in time to find out all about it before the scheme starts.
And a name that would appear later on. Yeah. And I think there's something, maybe a little bit of a trademark of the COI, trying to introduce particular characters.
You can get the address of your national insurance place from the post office.
So Charley is an everyman. It's a name that everyone associates kind of with, actually, a slightly dim person is a proper Charley. That's that expression. But on the other hand, it's also a name of a kind of cheerful, everyday man. So we get that in the Harrison Batchelor series, and he's the main character. He's a little guy who's on a bicycle, whistles his way, through the streets. And then, but also later on, we have the Charley Says, which most people are more familiar with those, which was the Kenny Everett voiced Marmalade Cat, which everybody recognises.
From its earliest days, the COI created a series of cautionary tales directly aimed at tackling a serious peacetime concern.
Watch out!
Road safety, because during the war, cars were off the road, there was petrol rationing, and a lot of these cars have been sitting in their garages for years. The MOT didn't exist, and cars were in a terrible state. I mean, tyres were probably flat, the brakes were probably faulty, so there were quite a few films about that, and just getting people used to using roads again and driving.
Since the first Highway Act back in 1835, road safety has been a perennial topic of government public safety campaigns to the present day.
Sooner or later, 1 in every 6 people alive today, one of you 6, will have a road accident.
This statistic was responded to by the COI. And if you thought it can't happen to me, well, they targeted doubters personally.
No, it won't be you.
Using a well-aimed admonitory narration.
3.5 minutes.
Ambulance, St George's Cross, Shoreditch Road.
Road accidents are things that always happen to somebody else. But all over the country, day and night, the ambulances are waiting.
Yes, we'll send right away.
and then the ambulance is on its way. And en route, you have an image for, remember this is 1948, so we tend to think of this as the gentle era in public information film, and you see, it's all staged of course, but you see a young lady lying on the road being tended, injured or possibly dead as a result of a road accident. So within about a minute you've got a lot of information, you've got an emotional pitch, you've got drama, it's all there. It's classic public information.
And pulls the audience in straight away. And this audience are watching this at the cinema.
Yeah.
Why does this happen?
They've got the A and maybe the B film to go.
Is it just carelessness? Or don't you know any better?
And if you get it wrong, you'll get a big groan from the audience and a cue for the ice creams. So you've got to grab them right at the beginning, and that film grabs them by the throat.
You can see just from very early on how the COI are playing with the form that they would be utilising again and again in different ways throughout its career.
Absolutely. I think, the clip is only a minute, but there's so many different directions for the discipline of public information film to go in that film. And what you see over the decades that come is a kind of steady refinement of those techniques and an increasing mastery of the ability to turn a civil servant's briefing into a compelling piece of cinema that will work for an audience. And that is a very, very difficult thing to do. And already in 1948 there you can see it being done really rather well.
They also found the perfect vehicle to instruct us how to use the pedestrian crossing or avoid many other potential hazards of the day.
To soar on high.
Richard Massingham.
Show me the treasures nature has. The trees, the flowers. The trees, the flowers. Show me the treasures nature has. The trees, the flowers.
Coke and gas. I'm from Mr. Firm. Always glad to be of service. Anything to do with coal, gas, or its byproducts. Burning to serve you, sir.
Extremely interesting, but I'm trying to write some verse at the moment. I don't happen to need your services. Thank you very much. Excuse me.
So glad you bring up Massingham, because he's really one of the underrated geniuses of British film, I think. He was a medic by training, as well as an actor and filmmaker who got into film in the 30s, initially as an amateur filmmaker, and then really hits his stride during the war, when he's both a sometime director, producer, owns a production company, but also appears in many of these films.
Massingham's skill was to combine his passion to educate with a highly crafted cinematic style. A very English eccentric, perfectly suited for audiences raised on the silent screen antics of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. With a childlike charm, Massingham's thick-set hangdog face could twist and turn to the commands of his off-screen narration. Take his short film Agricultural Holiday Camps from 1947. When Britons were encouraged to lend a hand on the land, taking their holidays on farms to help out in a time of world food shortage.
That's me today.
It begins with a cheerful Massingham at his office desk. Then we see the very same man film before his holiday.
That's me again. This time a year ago.
Dishevelled, stressed and falling apart under his workload.
I had nowhere to go for my holiday.
He takes himself off to the farm. At first, he's struggling with the physical labour.
I don't mind telling you, I did find things a bit difficult for the first day or two. I wasn't used to this kind of life.
But then, a transformation.
But I quickly settled down.
Cheerfully, with pitchfork in hand, loading up the hay.
Everybody was very friendly.
Driving a tractor.
Besides, I got a kick out of helping to solve the world food shortage.
Quaffing a pint of frothy, locally brewed ale.
Yes, life was very good. So, I'm going again this year.
And finally, we see the rejuvenated Massingham back at his office desk.
And that's why I'm looking like this.
Massingham was probably most famous for his appearances in the Coughs and Sneezes Spread Diseases campaign. He does, in a completely genius way, connect into something, as you say, very British, perhaps very particularly English, that eccentricity sort of slightly put upon, slightly quirky and surreal, There's all sorts of things going on in Massingham's films. They managed to be very experimental but totally populist at the same time. And he really knew how to use comedy when it was called for in order to make a message far more engaging than it would have been otherwise.
Hi, stop it, you. Stop it, stop it. Come here, what do you think you're up to? You've probably infected thousands of people already. What do you think this is for?
You see Massingham with that glorious, melancholy face, presented with a handkerchief at the end of a whole series of almost, they're jump cuts, really.
Sneeze.
These sort of jump cut, cough, sneeze.
Got it?
Cough, sneeze, cough, sneeze. And then finally he gets given the handkerchief at the end and is told, now you can carry on. So it's that very British mixture of surrealism, practicality, a sense of humour, not taking everything too seriously.
Fine. Now you can carry on.
The fact that the phrase coughs and sneezes spread diseases kind of continue to live in the national consciousness for many decades afterwards, and I think it was actually used again officially only several years ago, indicates its potency.
From germ warfare to nuclear power. It's 1956. Perhaps you're sitting in a makeshift cinema in the darkened school or church hall. And beaming from the projector, a screen full of stars. There's a thunder flash. A huge telescope is manoeuvred into place. The screen is bathed in vivid orange solar flashes. This is the public information film Atomic Achievement, triumphantly celebrating the power of the atom to mark the opening of the nuclear power station, Calder Hall in Cumbria.
The first full-scale atomic power station in the world.
The mood is optimistic. Men in white lab coats handling spent fuel rods with what looks like kitchen tongs.
And not only are the bright, clean buildings a startling contrast to their grimy, coal-fired relatives, but an effort of imagination is required to think of these neatly packaged cartridges of uranium as fuel for an industrial furnace.
One thing I think you will struggle to find in most of the COI's work, you might find it a little bit around the edges, but you will struggle to find much in the way of sort of subversive political statements. At the end of the day, the COI is an arm of the state. Most of what it does is quite apolitical. It's not party political, but it does reflect state policy. And clearly state policy at the time of this film was to shift the energy balance and to build up Britain's nuclear programme. And the film is inevitably sort of uncritical of that. Not only that, it's presenting a sort of, we would today say, a very glossy statement about the nuclear energy industry. It's presenting it as something that's tremendously exciting.
And the new giant went to work in silence.
For us, because we're almost time travelling here, we can see films from, several decades over a short period of time. We jump forward only 15, 16 years. And you have Protect and Survive, which is a very different to us, different image of the nuclear as in threat.
You should now move yourself and your family to the safest area in your fallout room. That is, you should get inside your inner refuge and stay there. After 2 days, the danger from fallout will get less, but don't take any risks by contact with it. The longer you stay in your refuge, the better it will be for you.
So this was a series of films which were intended to be shown in the event of nuclear attack. As a result, they never were shown because thankfully there was no nuclear attack. But it's sort of fascinating to see the COI's very sort of practical, hands-on advice about what to do applied to a completely nightmarish situation.
Listen to your radio. Stay where you are and keep listening to your radio.
Along the corridor?
That's right.
So where are you taking me?
Down the corridor of the Conservation Centre. And
the COI's vast public information film collection is now protected and survives in Berkhamsted, Hertfordshire, in the BFI's National Archive.
But this one is solely for film.
We're in one of the storerooms that contain the film cans themselves. 30 foot high, stacks and stacks and stacks, cans on shelves, and there's a cherry picker there that you can use to go up and down to pick some of these cans up. What we're in it's like a sort of giant warehouse, but this warehouse is full of the nation's memories, film memories. This is the central resting place of film. Thousands and thousands of them. It's now 4 years since the closure of the COI, but pallets full of canisters of 16 and 35mm film are still arriving from deep storage to the BFI's Conservation Centre.
We've just taken delivery of 250 individual film cams, all from the COI collection. So obviously we'll unpack these and then start to store them onto the shelves in one of our vaults. Obviously we have a list of all of the titles we've got here that we'll check off against.
It's great to see the original Central Office Information reel. This is an orange tin, the COI logo. It says negative, and we've got the title, the moniker, the Glen. And what is interesting, of course, it's got the address of the Central Office Information: Hercules Road, Westminster Bridge Road, London, SE1.
It was Hercules House, Hercules Road, and it had been there for a long time. It's funny, it looked like the ultimate government building, but in fact it wasn't actually owned by the government, as we subsequently discovered.
Alan Bishop is now Chief Executive of London's South Bank, but following an advertising career at Saatchi & Saatchi, he became Chief Exec at the Central Office of Information in 2002. Simon Blaxland ran the COI's radio department, overseeing campaigns.
It was not a beautiful building by any stretch of the imagination, and I believe it's been gutted now. But it was a very vibrant place, and one of the great things about COI was every campaign you worked on had some very special message that you needed to get over. It was either kill your speed, not a child, sexual health, the whole AIDS campaigns that came out on radio and TV, if you're travelling abroad. It was all a very, very serious message. It was informing rather than trying to get you to buy something.
It drew people from the advertising business, from the TV production business, a lot of ex-journalists because of all the different communications challenges they had. So it had a very creative atmosphere, slightly tamped down so that we all gave the impression that we were good government servants.
You're a radio ad man, but you were at that point a civil servant.
Yes, I even wore a pinstripe suit for a while. Yes, I was a civil servant, and my grade was Senior Information Officer, which really, that was someone who looks after the publicity coming out of a government department. Because we were in a separate building and we weren't in Whitehall, I think the COI felt very much an independent part of the government.
But we were also very conscious that we were there not to show off our own talents, but to try and find the best talent that was out there. And we were using a whole array of advertising agencies and production companies and trying to find the best to do that work. And because of the kind of work it was, most of them were very interested in doing it because it was creatively more challenging than a lot of what they were doing with the best will in the world. It's more interesting to try and persuade people not to drink and drive than it is to use a particular brand of nappy or whatever.
And what they don't realise is that no matter how good they are at controlling their cars, they can't control everything else on the road. So don't just be a clunker. Clunk click.
The COI had access to healthy budgets, an opportunity to communicate a wide range of challenging concepts, and a roster of established and aspiring filmmakers over the years. Paul Rother, Humphrey Jennings, John Krish, Nicholas Rogue, Peter Greenaway all helped make the COI a real force in the film industry. The BFI's Patrick Russell.
The public information film through the COI was a major source of livelihood for the film industry. I would think a lot of the film labs were kept open because of the sheer amount of work that was being processed, that was produced for the COI. You do also see some film people cut their teeth on public information films who go on to more mainstream careers in the film industry. So I think it's got an important place in the very complex family tree of British film history.
When we are all waiting patiently at the traffic lights
There's nothing more aggravating than the chap who cuts in.
A clip from the Don't Be Rude on the Road campaigns at the tail end of the 1950s and early 60s. A decade where Tufty the Squirrel and his pals were charged with the task of teaching young children lessons about personal safety while crossing the roads.
There's lots of road safety, which are all about kind of being polite on the road. In the 60s, there's quite a lot about just being courteous and giving way to people.
We all know that this show of bad manners saves no time. So don't be rude on the road.
At its peak, the Tufty Club boasted 25,000 branches nationwide.
Tufty, what's the right way to cross the road?
But by the end of the decade, such genteel Toy Town scenarios would be replaced. As the 1970s started to rev up, road safety instruction reflected a harsher climate that owed more to the full throttle age, increasing car ownership and high-speed motorways, and a cultural landscape that was less Policeman Badger and more D.I. Regan of the Sweeney.
That all disappears, and it's much more about, it'd be brilliant to do a compilation of these films and just showing how people meet their deaths, basically, going through windscreens. I mean, there's an appalling one from the Clunk Click campaign, which is called Human Cannonball.
Would you be prepared to be a human cannonball? Would you be prepared to be fired at 30 miles per hour, head first, into a sheet of glass? You wouldn't. Then never leave your seatbelt off when you're driving round town.
So you see a lot more blood, a lot more graphic, people actually dying or dead on the roads.
Today, Carol still has a slight limp.
Where do you think that kind of visual presentation of road safety and the dangers came from?
Don't get careless when you're only halfway across, especially in complicated places like this. Keep looking, keep listening, keep living.
I think maybe what was going on with the 1970s, and if you look in the feature films, you get a lot more of certainly the horror and the gothic films. I think that had an influence. Things like Lonely Water, which is a very famous, with Donald Pleasance voicing the figure of death.
I am the spirit of dark and lonely water, ready to trap the unwary, the show-off, the fool. And this is the kind of place you'd expect to find me. But no one expects to find me here. It seems too ordinary. But that pool is deep. The boy is showing off. The bank is slippery.
What was going on in Don't Look Now on a kind of Nick Rogan, I think these did have influences on public information, because sometimes feature directors were actually involved in making these films.
It's the perfect place for an accident.
Oh, look, there's someone in the water. Quick, it's that big...
John Mackenzie, of course, was famous for things like The Long Good Friday. Did one of the famous films called Apaches, which was about agricultural safety, and children, and a series of children had basically done away with by falling in a very gruesome way, which I think terrorised a lot of children in the 1980s, especially in rural areas.
The entire Apache nation gather in the hills above the headquarters of the U.S. Army in New Mexico.
I saw it first in school. I think I must have been about 9 at the time. It scared the bejesus out of me. In the film, you have a group of children, it's called Apaches because they're playing cowboys and Indians.
Apaches have taken Fort Sumner! Palefaces are massacred! Ah!
Over the course of the film, each one of them dies a horrible death, falling into a slurry pit, chopped up by a combine harvester. The really curious thing about it, and here we're back into that strange netherworld that's sort of realistic but hyper-realistic at the same time. It has a sort of dreamlike nightmare logic to it. After each one of the kids dies, the others continue. It's almost as if it's a sort of dreamlike fable, and it continues until they're all eventually killed off, other than, I think, one child. So this film is at the very hard edge of absolutely terrifying you into not doing what the film doesn't want you to do.
Apaches, made in 1977, was 26 minutes long. As well as Prince doing the school circuit, the film was also broadcast on commercial television, especially by the TV companies covering rural areas. Television was the natural place for the public information film, especially the shorter ones, ideal for filling the gaps in broadcasting schedules. For the COI, the 1970s was a golden age, churning out films on an industrial scale. And as censorship laws began relaxing, it tackled more and more uncomfortable subjects. The COI tried different approaches to the public fears of stranger danger.
Charlie and I were in the park. Then this man came up and said, would I like to see some puppies? And I said yes. And I was going to go, but Charlie stopped me. Charlie's reminded me, my mum says I shouldn't go off with people I don't know. Then the man went away. He says never go anywhere with men or ladies you don't know.
Charley Says, the famous animation series talking directly to youngsters to get the message across.
Say no to strangers.
Come on, jump in.
But the COI also used actors in more realistic scenarios to portray children being abducted by paedophiles.
And he was all right to you in the car, was he? Didn't say anything else?
No.
Some government officials found these films too distressing, and they were denied an airing on TV for many years.
And what happened when you went inside the house?
First he was all nice to me, gave me cakes and sweets. And then he tried to touch me, tried to take my clothes off. I said I didn't like it.
And what happened then?
He tried to kiss me. And he hit my arm.
Oh, poor Teresa. That was when you shouted out, was it?
I shouted out and somebody come. It was horrible.
Teresa could have been hurt far worse than that. Someone might not have come. That nice ordinary man was sick and dangerous. In real life, you can't tell which people are good and which are bad. So, whatever your age, it's up to you to look after yourself. And take care. You don't want to end up dead or in hospital. You know what to do. Say no to strangers.
There is a stranger you can trust, and he's wearing a tight-fitting white and green costume.
Emergency! Calling Green Cross man! Green Crosses! Where do you think you're going, you dumbo?
Green Cross.
When you get to the curb, always stop, stop, stop!
Sorry, Green Cross.
You were one of the first great British superheroes.
Well, I was a well-known bodybuilder, weightlifter, and so physically I had a good physique to go into that sort of costume.
No, you look the part.
Yeah.
David Prowse, the actor donning the ultimate baddie robes of Darth Vader in Star Wars, was also the kids' crusader, monitoring potential dangers on Britain's streets, where accidents involving children were on the rise.
Remember, stop near the curb, not on it. That's the way.
When the campaign took off, it was there for a reason, because of the amount of fatalities and injuries on the road. When were you becoming aware that something was happening, that this campaign was working?
They used to release figures, the road accident figures on the road as far as children were concerned, on a sort of monthly basis. It was wonderful just to watch the figures going down and down and down since the Green Cross Code campaign's been on.
Think I better have a word with those two. That wasn't very clever, was it? If you'd been looking and listening all the way across, that wouldn't have happened.
And when you visited schools, were you dressed as a Green Cross man?
Oh yeah, I've still got the outfit. I've got it upstairs.
I should have asked you to put it on.
And the fact that the Green Cross Code man was also Darth Vader. I used to have the whole school, like 400 kids in the hall. And then at the end of the programme, I used to say, anybody got any questions you'd like to ask me? I talked for ages about road safety, and I talked a bit about Star Wars and everything else. I never got one question about road safety. Not one. Every question I got was about Star Wars, which is lovely because it made me that much more interesting to the kids.
looking at the films now, I find really effective is if you're, as a youngster watching them, you see a superhero, Green Cross man, but also you see real life situations. It's a real road, real
That's right,
children,
yeah, real children.
real traffic.
There's me on the side of the road with the children lined up beside me.
Look, it's Green Cross Man.
Looks like you two need a lesson in crossing the road. My little friend is going to show you how. First, find a safe place to cross.
And even you had your little robot friend at one point.
I've still got it there. He's in the window. In the back window.
Oh, yes, there he
Droid,
is.
Yeah.
There's Droid.
Yeah, he's in there. It's still working.
We won't be there when you cross the road, so always use the Green Cross hand.
Back in the 1970s, along with his trusty robot companion, the Green Cross man used sophisticated surveillance cameras and screens to keep an eye on our streets. But today, thanks to films commissioned by an insurance company, he's had to come out of retirement to warn adult pedestrians of the risks of using mobile technology.
Who are you? I am the Green Cross Code Man. Everywhere I look, pedestrians are using headphones, smartphones, social media, and all manner of other infernal mobile inventions that distract them and put their lives at danger. Now, why don't you try crossing again, but this time, listen, listen, listen. Grown-ups, always use the Green Cross code because I won't be there when you cross the road.
The repeated screenings of characters like the Green Cross man and Charley the cat meant that they are now part of our collective memory bank. Yet I'd argue that it was the experimental nature of some of the films that has indelibly etched them into our imaginations. A prime example is a 45-second film called Searching from 1974.
It feels as though it's a single shot prowling through this burnt out wreck of a house. It's heartbreaking, it's horrifying, it creates this entire subconscious world. Probably one of the most effective films ever made in the 70s, of any length, in any genre.
Please keep matches away from children.
And the message isn't told to us until the end. We don't know it's about keeping matches away from children. We know it's about a fire, and we certainly hear a child throughout and the breathing. So is it the breathing of someone in fire safety apparatus going through the house where obviously we think a child has died? These are all left to our imagination.
It's a film that's designed to have an absolutely visceral impact on you the first time you see it, and then when you see it again, to kind of feel that pit in the stomach feeling each time you're put through it again. Brilliant direction by the late John Krish, who directed that particular film and was one of the masters of the public information film, and in fact was known in the business as Dr. Death because of the number of horrifying incidents that he orchestrated on film. But his motive was, we go back to the 1940s again, it was absolutely that public service motive. So to my mind, there's nothing exploitative about this film, but the film is designed to hit you where it hurts.
3 decades on, another remarkably inventive public information campaign turned to artist Gillian Waring to direct a film called You Never Know, designed to warn young people of the dangers of being groomed on the internet.
My hobbies are football, cycling. I like playing in the street, and I like going down to the park and stuff.
The film begins with us looking at a bedroom ceiling, and we hear the voice of a young boy talking about his hobbies.
I like collecting medals, like football medals. I like the way they're presented and stuff, because some are shiny and some are like blue, silver.
The camera begins to slowly move downwards, and we discover that it's not a boy talking, but a grown man sitting next to a computer. And chillingly, it's the voice of the boy coming from his lips.
I always make sure that if I have a football player, it ain't just one with a leg out, it's one with an actual football on it.
One issue that was new was the dangers of what could go on the internet. And in a way, when that realisation developed, it was pretty much the same sort of message once upon a time tried to get across in campaigns like Stranger Danger, but updated because the stranger was now abusing their position in a different way than they'd done in the past, or were able to conceal themselves online, were able to groom kids. And in the beginning, it was simply pointing out that that could happen, and to remember that you had actually had no idea who you might be communicating with.
What, at that point, were the remits of the job? Because, of course, when we look at the original films, you know, some of the key themes, road safety, obviously all the way through to decay, is something that was very much part of that kind of public health presentation. When you joined in 2002, what were the key areas that you would be inheriting?
So there was still that original role, but it has expanded massively since then. The big increase was during the Thatcher years, led by the need to get the huge privatisations understood by and supported by the public. And then successive governments after that, as they introduced an array of policies. If they were an active government, they normally had a lot to try and get over and communicate.
There are nearly 5 million council tenants in England and Wales, many with families like yours. They go on paying rent every week. But if you've been a council tenant for 2 years or more, you now have the legal right to buy your house or flat. Discounts range from 32% to 60%. And remember, buying on a mortgage can often cost little more than paying rent. In the next few days, you'll get a leaflet through the door with all the facts. And when you've read the facts, you can decide whether to turn your home into your house.
And it was public information, but of course it was always controversial because sometimes some of these policies were politically controversial. So they were watched with a keen eye to make sure that they weren't simply becoming advertisements for a particular political party.
And how did you get round that kind of controversy?
I think you simply had to try and argue for the recognition that once something was law, once it had been approved by Parliament, the fact that it emanated from a particular political party was neither here nor there. It had to be explained to the people, particularly if there were politicians who had penalties. You know, it would be a terrible omission of a government's duty if you say, well, you're going to punish people by law for certain offences, sometimes quite severe punishments, and if you don't then making people clearly aware of what it is they're supposed to be doing. I mean, really simple things like the deadlines for a tax return. There are penalties attached to not doing it. You've got to make absolutely sure that people are highly aware of those deadlines.
That's the sound of someone being found guilty of benefit fraud. It happens every hour, nearly 30 times every day, or nearly 200 times every week. So, if you're committing benefit fraud, how long will it be before someone comes calling? If you know someone who's still getting away with it, call the free and confidential Benefit Fraud Hotline. Targeting fraud.
In this case, what we're hearing isn't a public information film about the punitive dangers facing benefit fraudsters. In fact, it's a radio campaign from the year 2000. Campaigns on the airwaves were often imaginatively designed. Radio producer Simon Blaxland.
It's the Army campaign with Tank. That was set up as a series of challenges for the listener. And the advertising agency on that was Saatchi & Saatchi.
Listen closely. You're about to get a crash course in using the Milan anti-tank missile.
It was very interesting because it was purely about sound. It became quite famed at the time.
This is the sound of a British tank. This is an enemy tank. Have you got that?
But As they were switched back and forwards, you, as the listener, were trying to work out which was which, and found it more and more difficult.
British tank. Enemy tank. Enemy tank. British tank. Now, just imagine that it's night. You're in a battle and armed with a Milan anti-tank missile. A tank is coming towards you through some trees. So which is it? Friend or foe? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the army, you may only have seconds to decide. That's why before soldiers use equipment like Milan, they're trained to use equipment like their ears. If you're between 16 and 26 and you'd like to learn skills like this, visit your local Army Careers Office or Job Centre.
And again, we were very lucky. The Army was a very good client because they sort of said, well, we have our speciality, that's your speciality. We'll leave you to it. If we don't like it, we'll tell you, but just get on with it.
Be the best.
There was a campaign we did for Kill Your Speed, Not a Child, and that was child voices, and it was, again, aimed at someone driving in their car. It was the time that Twin Peaks was on TV, so there's very ethereal music, very similar to Twin Peaks you hear.
You're going to kill me. You're going to kill me because nothing you can think of is more important than the 8:30 sales meeting. You're going to kill me because it's your turn to pick up the kids from school, but you forgot you had to get the petrol on the way, so that made you late.
Kill Your Speed, Not a Child. That was quite graphic stuff, aimed particularly at people in their cars at the time who might be trying to get somewhere too fast.
But not all road safety campaigns were as dark and tragic as Kill Your Speed. Humour was also used to impart a serious message.
Good morning, sir. So, how many pints have you managed this morning?
About 70 or 80 so far.
Right, if you'd like to step out of the float, please, sir.
What are you doing? Ow! The Rugby World Cup matches start early. But remember that 2,000 people are breathalyzed every day throughout the day.
70 or 80.
Don't drink and drive anytime.
Classic stuff.
I love it.
I'd love to know how many milkmen have been breathalyzed over the years. And I suppose it wasn't just directed to milkmen.
No, I don't think so at all. I think that was sort of the mechanic for getting the idea over of having too many pints, because I think the Rugby World Cup then, it's early in the morning, so it's milkmen. Milkmen, pints of beer, pints of milk.
I'm delighted in a way that this material exists.
Yeah.
It's not lost in... Because so much radio is so transient.
Yes, again, that was because COI was part of the Home Office, and so was a government department. You had to archive everything.
While listening and viewing the archive, you can see that humour is used sparingly. Sadly, that's the nature of the message itself. Take an erupting volcano.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure.
And a chisel striking 4 letters into a block of black stone.
Anyone can get it, man or woman. So far it's been confined to small groups, but it's spreading. So protect yourself. And read this leaflet when it arrives. If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you. So don't die of ignorance.
The AIDS campaign was commissioned by the Department of Health through the COI. The films are designed to scare you. Perhaps the most extreme example of the light bulb moment in film. It's like, you don't think you care about this? 45 seconds later, boy, do you care. At least that's the theory.
And at that point, you've not seen a human body. You've not heard from someone who may be suffering with AIDS. It's just purely on symbolism.
It's all through metaphor and visual symbol and also mood. Of course, it was controversial at the time, and it was controversial both from public morality campaigners who had their concerns about sexually transmitted diseases being the subject of such a public campaign, but also in terms of how the AIDS virus was being handled by government. Obviously, the very doom-laden apocalyptic nature of it, which kind of almost suggests, well, it absolutely suggests that AIDS is a death sentence. You know, if you don't read the leaflet, you're done for.
Can these types of social health campaigns be perceived as scaremongering? Or are they an essential part of a government's duty to communicate these issues? Alan Bishop again.
Despite people saying, oh, we don't like the nanny state, we don't like our lives being interfered with, there's a much more common reaction for people to say the government must do something about it, something must be done about this. So I think the expectation of what government was supposed to be doing in dealing with some of the social issues of the country expanded a lot from my parents' generation, and that therefore led to an increase in the kind of communication that government had to make.
And I wonder if you could give me some examples, the kind of films you were making that kind of represent that point.
I think the films that were designed to contend with alcohol abuse and drug abuse reflected that need for government to try and deal with those issues.
When friends told Kate smoking heroin would make her feel good, they forgot to tell her something else. How bad it would also make her feel. How she'd start to look tired, spotty, and unhealthy. How she'd lose her friends, her looks, and her interest in everything but heroin. How she'd soon have to take heroin not to get high, but just to stop feeling down. How she'd eventually risk blood disease, liver damage, even heart failure.
Yeah, but I'm still alive, I suppose.
Don't be a dummy. Heroin really does screw you up.
And now, in 2016, high up on the risk agenda, it's terrorism.
The scene at the centre of the worst of last night's Paris attacks. French security forces assault the Bataclan theatre.
S'il vous plaît, qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Some terrified hostages escaped through windows, but inside, over 80 people were murdered by the gunmen, who also set off explosives.
The National Police Chief Council responded with the public information film Stay Safe. Its slogan, Run, Hide, Tell.
Thankfully, firearms and weapons attacks in the UK are very rare. But tragic events from around the world remind us...
Detective Chief Superintendent Scott Wilson.
It's a gun attack in an office building, and what you've got is you've got a meeting happening within that office building, within an office.
You should see this as an opportunity to plan how you would respond to such a threat and stay safe.
And what they're the group you're watching, how are they going to evacuate themselves out the building?
If you hear gunshots, the best option is to evacuate, but only do so if it won't put you in greater danger.
You get someone there who sort of takes charge, telling the group to quiet, to leave their belongings behind, to keep calm.
First, consider your route. Act quickly and quietly.
He's looking for the escape route, and he then takes the group out the escape route.
Insist others come with you, but don't let their indecision slow you down.
It then takes you to another pair where we get to the hide piece. They obviously can't get out of the building, and what they're doing, they're finding somewhere where they're going to get protection from the gunmen, and they're barricading themselves in, they're turning off their phones. So we've used the two different groups to show the two different concepts. One is get out, but if you can get out, where are you going to hide? And then the final bit is them notifying the authorities.
If you're able to evacuate, get as far away from the danger area as possible. Call the police. Dial 999 and tell them clearly the location of you and the attackers.
What we had is we had a police staff member who went through this training, and she was actually caught up in the Tunisian attack. She was in that hotel with her mother on the beach when that attack took place. And she emphasises in part of a wider training package how she used run, hide and tell to get us out of that situation. She's seen people congregating within the hotel complex, within the hotel in Tunisia, and realised that wasn't the thing to do. And she got home safely. And I think that's quite impactful. You want to make this as real as possible, and I think that film does that without frightening. What we always say to people, we don't want to alarm people, we want to make them more alert.
The police may be unable to distinguish you from the attacker. They may treat you firmly. Do everything they tell you to do.
When I was younger, I'm sure when you were younger, you may have watched public information films on television, at the cinema, when everyone was watching it. It's a different world as far as social media and ways of getting this stuff out there.
It was important that we put it on a social media platform where people could pick up. That was really, really important. What was also important is we released it at the right time. What I felt we couldn't do was release this after, if we did have a similar attack in the UK, that wouldn't be the right time to release this film. Because of what we've seen in Paris, that was the right time now to release this, because the stance of ISO had changed then. A lot of the attacks they'd carried out before were against security personnel, police officers. We then had the attacks we seen in November 15, where it was against civilians, everyday people doing everyday business. And at that point, we felt the UK need to be aware of this film we've pulled together.
The Central Office of Information was closed down by the coalition government in 2012. However, public information films are still being made by individual government departments and agencies. And the BFI continues to catalogue and digitise 6 decades worth of films bequeathed to it by the COI. Patrick Russell.
They say you can never really understand the present until you've understood the past. And it's a very good demonstration of, in a way, the importance of archiving, actually, which is that often it's the things that you take for granted, it's the things that seem to be ephemeral in their own moment that turn out to last the longest. The underbelly of the British film and TV industry, including a genre like the public information film, actually, when you look back at it in hindsight, you realise that the number of stories that it has to tell, it's everything like as rich as, you know, the great feature films or the films that in their own day get all of the acclaim. And I also think there's something touching and admirable in a way about films which, as you say, they're often uncredited. Certainly they don't necessarily attract huge media attention or acclaim, but the idea of being really, really creative, but really creative for a purpose, and not only that, 9 times out of 10 for a good purpose. I think there's something very appropriate about giving it due celebration in hindsight that perhaps at the time it didn't when it was taken for granted. And we're making available a lot of these films online now. So if you go to BFI Player, you can see a digest of the history of 100 years of public information films, including a lot of the COI's best work.
There's a child whose life has changed in the last year. He's given up football because he can't see the ball too well. He can't cross the road alone because he can't be sure it's clear. And he won't see much of the fireworks this year because last year a firework was thrown and blew up in his face. Somewhere there are other children whose lives are going to be changed. Will one of them be your child?